Hang on 1 second. I want to make sure I do.
Sure.
Okay. Could you say it again?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay. I'm hearing it okay, so the recording going well. As long as there's no other noise that bothers you, I think we're okay.
Great.
Seems to be working.
We're 5 minutes ago. So
Yes. Yeah, Christina should be down short. Okay, I think that's about it.
Yep.
We'll get started in just a little bit. Okay.
Do you know who else will be here?
Most of the project leaders of our division should be. Emilio's definitely going to be here as well, because I know he's very tied in with Christina's work.
Yep.
Aram Galston's actually absent today, might be participating remotely. And I feel that Craig Knobloch, who is our division director, should probably be here also, for sure. Those are the ones I know right off the top of the head. And the others, I guess it depends on their availability. I saw Yolanda Gill walking.
Yeah.
As we were walking down here, so she might be at the talk also. I think the majority of project leaders should.
Okay. Then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Keith. Thank you.
Hey. Yes. Always love the coffee. I didn't get a chance to look at your like I guess bibliography and all that yet. So you're that Kay Burghardt, the one who's collaborated with Christine in the past. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I'd be amazed if there are other K Burghardts. Well, to be fair, well, two of my uncles are in universities. One in Texas A&M.
Excellent.
Also, I assume that Christina's been mentioning my name. I think you pronounced it correctly.
Oh no. No. I guess I just have a way with names, I suppose.
No, people seem to think it's Burghardt or something weird like that. The hard GH.
Do you have any current takes on, I guess, I don't know if you'll speak to this at all, but I've been especially interested in like moderation.
I think sorry.
In like moderation and things as of late, and especially just sort of the heavy reliance on crowdsourced labor.
So crowdsourced versus use of moderation.
Well, yeah, but for acting as moderators, I suppose.
Oh, I see. Not like eating in moderation. It's moderation is in moderation.
Yeah, right. Especially when it comes to like information dynamics and also like social, like the big social platforms and dealing with like the.
There might be truth to that. There's a nice paper in 2010, which I won't be discussing today, where they're showing that group intelligence, similar to how there's like individual intelligence like IQ, they had a measure for group intelligence, which depended on it had very little effect. Very little of group intelligence was due to individual intelligence. It actually had more to do with people taking turns speaking, and empathy. Yeah.
Okay.
Things like
I
that.
idea.
Yeah. So, which makes me suspect that a moderator could encourage, for instance, equal turn speaking, could allow for or remind people to be more empathetic. So it's possible that one moderator could increase in group. But as far as the work I do, I don't do much work on that. I'm sort of looking at the cognitive heuristics sort of thing. So for me, it's like people might try to think of might try to decide what is a good idea, and like they might be given a few options. They might be given a few options, and then the problem is that they can be very easily nudged to make one decision or another.
Right.
And you even see this when people make sort of moral decisions. There's a nice paper in 2015 PNAS by some people at UC Merced who are trying to have people decide between like I think common moral scenarios, like should you allow one person dying and 3 people living or 3 people
like the trolley problem.
Yeah. I don't remember what it was quite, but
right.
Well, they had 2 choices, and they were sort of blinking one or the other. When they saw that people were paying attention to the one on the right, they would stop and say, "What is your choice?" And because they knew which option they looked at last, they're actually influencing people to make one choice over the other.
Okay.
So they would force people to look at or they would make people choose when they look at the right one, or choose when they look at the left one, and they were much more biased to choose the thing they looked at most recently. So things as simple as that. What you look at, or seeing popularity, not just heuristics, but sort of minor nudges are ways to change people's opinion. That's sort of a little bit more of what I do.
Right. Thank you.
So this is not actually a project.
Yeah,
right?
but it's
Specific forecast. But they have a forecast like Portugal and manage that. But they have the project. So like I texted them the picture of the crowdsourcing. But actually, mom and Andres, they love it. Join us for lunch.
Yeah. I mean, it's correct?
All right, maybe we should start. All right, thank you all for coming on this off-day seminar day. I'm really excited to have Keith here. I've known actually Keith for several years, and I've actually worked with Keith for several years now. And he actually on crowdsourcing, trying to understand the limits of crowdsourcing and the wisdom of crowds. And Keith was, some of you might actually remember Keith. He was here a couple of summers ago. He was an intern here, and we had a paper in ICWSM trying to characterize psychological dimensions from behavioral data. And we actually continued working more or less on this off time since that. And in fact, when he came here this morning, he was actually sitting on my computer trying to start up another batch of Amazon Mechanical Turk experiments. He was actually working here right before he gave this talk. So I'm really looking forward to talking about seeing this talk, and I hope you enjoy it as well.
Thank you. Okay. I'll take a moment for me.
A couple more stragglers. You missed my introduction saying that Keith was actually working earlier at my computer, starting up another batch of experiments. I hope it's not to violate any rules. Candidates, working.
So yeah, the work I do is on crowdsourcing, as you mentioned, and that's summarized by the title of my talk, which is the Emergent Brain: Understanding How Crowd Wisdom Succeeds and Fails. First, to give you an outline of what I'm going to do, I'm going to first discuss who I am as a researcher. Then I'm going to be giving my research motivation, why I study crowdsourcing, before I get into the meat of the presentation, which is understanding how wise are groups exactly, and more specifically, what is the effective functional heuristic? What factors actually affect the wisdom of crowds, like how people think, as well as the influence of individuals. And finally, I'm going to be concluding by discussing how do we correlate popularity and quality, or how do we improve that correlation. So who I am? Well, I had a BS and PhD in physics at the University of Maryland. As an undergrad, I did work in experimental physics and gravity experiments, and then a lot of theory, high energy physics and graph theory. But despite that sort of very physicsy approach, I sort of migrated more towards the computer science and applied physics sort of realm. As a grad student, I did work in real networks with two people at the University of Maryland, Michelle Gervin and Bill Rand, one in physics and one in business. My thesis was the physics of ideas, where my work was to use physics to understand human interactions, which is to say we go beyond the traditional role of physics. And then as I worked more and more with Christina Lerman, among others, I worked with people at the University of Maryland outside the physics realm, but also USC here, Institute of Molecular Modeling, UC Davis, where I'm currently a postdoc. We did a lot of work in what one calls computational social science, where we had a lot of interdisciplinary interactions to better understand, to use sort of computer science to understand social science. Where I had papers in physics journals, computer science conferences, and currently papers submitted to interdisciplinary journals like Science Advances, as well as network science journals. But the overall goal here was to say, what can quantitative analysis tell us about how groups think? So to give you some sort of research motivation, here we have a chess game, actually, that plays. So this would actually be what was known as Kasparov versus the World, which Gary Kasparov, one of the best chess players of all time, called the most important game ever played. Not the most important game he's ever played, although he's played many, the most important game ever. Essentially, in white here, person playing down here, was Gary Kasparov, and in black was about 50,000 players of lesser quality than he was, and moves were decided by plurality. What we find, in fact, was that popular moves heavily correlate with quality, in that essentially there was a lot of groundbreaking theory, groundbreaking ways in which these moves were constructed, and he said it was one of the most difficult games he's ever played. Gary Kasparov, I should say. Importantly, though, I should mention Kasparov still won, and actually I'll get into at the end of the presentation, I'll get into actually why that is. So in other words, there can be a lot of wisdom to crowds, and there can be limitations to crowds. And there can also be cases when crowds are simply not wise.
When was the game played? I never heard of it.
1999.
Oh, before, after Deep Blue.
Yeah, it was 2 years after Deep Blue. So that was also what made it kind of interesting. So if anyone might recall, Deep Blue was when Gary Kasparov actually competed against computer. And importantly, he lost the 3 out of the 5 rounds. So despite going against people who were or things who were better than him, he considered this game against many other people is one of his most important ones, and dedicated a whole book to it. So, and then there are cases when crowds simply not wise. As an example, one might know about the sort of famous tulip mania, where you had Dutch tulip bulbs. These things you just plant in your ground if anyone happens to garden at home. They were highly overvalued. The price, I think, went from, say, what would be equivalent to, say, less than $1 to many, many, many dollars. It peaked at around 30 times its initial, or 40 times its initial price. And that was back in 1637. So the issues of sort of bubbles have been a problem for a long time. And slightly more recently, in 1719, 1720, you had these companies founded in France and in America called Mississippi Company and South Sea Company, where they had stocks that were hugely overvalued, and then there was a crash soon afterwards. For example, South Sea Company was a company set up in England, which was supposedly doing mercantile exchange or sort of trading in South America. But this is during the era of the Spanish Armada. They had virtual no control over South America. They never actually made a profit, yet the prices of the stock was enormous. More recently, in the dot-com bubble, of course, where internet companies were greatly overvalued. And finally, most recently, we had the Bitcoin bubble, where we had cryptocurrency, which was heavily overvalued, and there was a dramatic drop in the price of cryptocurrency as well. Now, why I'm discussing bubbles is I go to a quote by James Surowiecki, who wrote this book called The Wisdom of Crowds. And in this book, he says bubbles and crashes, like what we saw in everything from the South Sea China bubble, from Tulip Mania, or most recently the Bitcoin bubble, are textbook examples of collective decision-making gone wrong. In a bubble, all the conditions that make groups intelligent, at least from his perspective, independence, diversity, and private judgment disappear. So, to give you some sort of background about what is crowd wisdom, it was popularized by Francis Galton back in 1907. So, where he basically his paper he wrote was surrounded on or was dedicated to this experiment he did in what was called West of London Fat, Stock, and Poultry Exhibition. We had people pay a small fee to guess the weight of an ox.
It was a nature paper.
It was a nature paper, I should mention that. Yes, it was a Nature 1907.
The studies publish nature papers these days.
Yeah. And he basically asked people to pay a small fee to guess the weight of an ox, and my gosh, good luck if you could get into Nature today. The median group guess was 1207 pounds, and the actual value was 1198 pounds. So a bunch of different guesses. Take the median, and suddenly you get less than 1% error. But to understand what actually creates this sort of crowd wisdom, we get to the idea of central limit theorem, where many independent guesses, if you take many independent guesses and take the mean or median of those guesses, you sort of approach the true value. You might take the mean of one guess and you get a wide distribution. Take the mean of 4 guesses and you might be closer to the truth, which is here. With more and more guesses, you get more and more close, or more and more likely to be approaching the true value.
These are all independent guesses, or each person gets them and guess?
These would be all independent guesses. So in the case of the ox, each person would pay a small fee to make a guess, and you had a bunch of different people who guessed. So now since the mean approaches true value, the variance goes to 0. Or if you have 2 guesses, this goes back to a famous theorem by Marquis de Condorcet back in 1785, called Condorcet's jury theorem, where essentially he proved it was sort of the first motivation that groups were wise. And it was one of the foundations as to why we have juries today. He was saying essentially collections of people are more likely to be correct. For example, guessing one's guilt or innocence. And I'll actually get to the truth of this in real data later in the presentation. So essentially he said, assume individuals are right with probability p, which is greater than 1/2, and the majority opinions are more likely to be correct. For example, in this plot to the right, we see that we might have one individual is correct with probability 60%, but the probability, but as you get larger and larger group sizes, the probability that the majority is correct increases ever more. For example, the probability that the majority opinion of 10 people is correct jumps to 70%. Probability that the majority of 50 people is correct jumps to 90%. And so you see that, simply put, with large groups, you have at least some, if you assume independent guesses again, you're more likely to be correct. Yes?
Does anybody consider the influence of argument within the group as a mechanism? So if everybody's guessing independently and kind of saying, okay, I think this, and they're all just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Is there any, are you going to talk about how some people might try to influence others and argue everybody?
Yes, actually, that based on real data, as I'll get to in a second, from anywhere from the 1960s to today, I was actually doing modeling on trying to understand that method. And I'll get to that in just a second. You had a question, Amelia?
Yeah, so aside from the consensus emergence that Ali was hinting to, so the way this is constructed mathematically, I think by definition, as long as the phi is greater than 0.5, this converges to 1.
Yeah.
To the infinite group size limit. Is there any equivalent parallel where the assumption is that maybe a fraction greater than, I don't know, some threshold of individuals has a probability above 0.5, but some people can have a probability of being right below 0.5?
That's a good point. Certainly, this sort of assumes homogeneous jurors, and in truth, that people are much more heterogeneous. There might be people who are just dead wrong. They're simply contrarian, and there might be people who are rather smart. I have not personally seen analytical studies on that. There have been work on, as I'll show a little later, on correlated jurors, jurors whose opinions are correlated with each other. But even then, they sort of assume for simplicity that they're homogeneous. I think there might be some good questions about maybe understanding that sort of question using simulations. But yeah, that would be a good point to make. So, but it's also notable this is the general result. We see it in humans. This is the motivation again for jurors, but also this well known as ensemble methods. Wisdom crowds, much like the ensemble methods, like random forest in machine learning. So the research questions I ask are, what creates crowd wisdom in real systems? So many of these systems are either analytical or heavily experimental. And more specifically, how do good ideas become popular? And why is crowd wisdom undermined, as in the case of bubbles, for example? What decouples popularity and quality, and are there practical ways to improve it? So the way I answer these questions are I combine methods from basically bits and pieces of my past from computer science, from physics, and from cognitive science, where I use big data analysis and modeling, as well as physics-inspired simulations, and finally experiments where we try to determine causality. Because many of these cases with big data, for example, you might very easily get correlations, but actually truly proving causality is much more difficult. And finally, I do formal analysis and proofs of sort of these simplified models of human behavior. So now let's get into the meat of the presentation, which is how wise are groups. There are sort of many modern applications of crowd wisdom. For example, question answering boards on Stack Exchange, content aggregation sites like Reddit, knowledge aggregation like Wikipedia, as well as social media like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, where in all these cases, essentially, you get sort of popular links or popular videos may correspond to a seemingly high-quality video or high-quality links. And there are many other examples. The idea is essentially given in this sort of example by Stack Exchange, for example. You might have someone post a question, other people might post an answer, and still other people might upvote it. But the problem is, as you can see, you might have a lot of people who spend a lot of time researching the question, and even if they seem to answer the question perfectly, it might not be liked. Essentially, this motivates some of my work in crowd wisdom, which is to say, we want to understand how to quantify coupling between quality and popularity. Do high-quality answers necessarily become popular? And other ways, if this is not true, other ways to increase this coupling. More specifically, I use data from Stack Exchange to ask why are answers popular on Stack Exchange? Is it because of quality, or are there human heuristics that heavily affect sort of popularity of answers? Where I use methods, where I use experiments essentially to determine causality, as well as big data for ecological validity. In other words, even if the experiments seem to suggest that this is a major factor, you might have simplified the experiment too much to represent what the real world. So we use big data to sort of verify the truth. So the way we do it is we have data from Stack Exchange, where Stack Exchange is composed of many different boards, what I call websites here, such as maybe many of you might be familiar with Stack Overflow. There's Mathematica, boards on C, etc. Where essentially we looked at all data from about 2008 until 2014, which corresponds to over 10 million answers and over 30 million votes. And the question we ask is, so what makes people vote for a particular answer? So what we specifically do is we use logistic regression, which is based on choice theory, where essentially how the probability the user votes for an answer is sigmoidal, so that probably they vote for an answer is 1 over 1 plus e to the minus u over epsilon, where essentially u is epsilon times the regression coefficient, which is the best fit parameters, and these x is the attributes. So essentially this is saying the probability to vote for an answer is a sigmoidal function that depends on the weighted sum of different attributes. If it depends on, for example, score, maybe that would be weighted more heavily than other attributes. And using those parameters, we determine what are the relative importance of individual. Using the best fit parameters, we determine what are the relative importance of individual attributes. For example, here we see that this is the parameter for web page order, which say if the parameter is high, that means people are more likely to choose the top answer they see and are much less likely to choose the bottom answer. And importantly, we see that as people see more and more answers, so the x-axis is the number of answers a voter sees. So as people see more answers, this attribute increases for both the probability to accept an answer, which is say this is something a question asker does. They can either accept an answer.
let's say, number of answers that are to a given question.
Yeah.
The user trying to decide whether this particular answer is a good answer to a given question.
Accepting answers that an asker can say this answer so it answers their question, and this quotient increases as well as voters both before and after accepted web page order increases. Therefore, for both voters and askers, they're much more likely to choose the top answer.
Why are there two green lines? What's the
Oh, so this gives you sort of the error bounds. We varied. So what we use is something called lasso regression, and we varied the cross validation error and so how much the quotient varied. So essentially, to roughly speaking, error. So what we essentially, in summarize, with more answers, you're more likely to choose the top answer. And this is even after other proxies for quality are controlled for, after we control for the score of the answer, etc. The effective actual score, which we call social influence, is rather small, as well as other factors. Other factors such as the reputation of the answer is actually rather insignificant. But there are pros and cons to big data. So it's important to remember, although you can easily find correlates, for example, the importance of answer position that I showed before, and you can make testable models. Logistic regression can have an AUC as high as 0.9. You can often run into an issue where correlations are not causation. Just because we find that this thing is highly predictive, just because we find a correlation between answer position and the probability to choose it, or sorry, the number of answers and the probability to choose top answers, that doesn't mean that the number of answers people see forces people to choose top answers, but answers listed first, I should say. And that attributes cannot be completely separated. There are many attributes here which are heavily correlated with each other. To give an example, answers are listed basically from high score, low score usually, and therefore there's inevitably a correlation between score and the answer position on the website. So, and finally, there's this effect of Simpson paradox, where essentially, if you aggregate data, for example, in this case, we might have individually disaggregated data where there's a positive correlation between X and Y. If you aggregate the data, you might find a negative correlation between X and Y. And therefore, aggregation can lead to, can create misleading effects. So this sort of motivates us to use an experiment where we sort of control for all these different different issues. So namely, with this experiment, we can do causation, such as does the position cause users to pick an answer, or does cognitive load cause a greater position bias? In other words, does the number of answers people see cause people to pick the top answers over the bottom ones? And to do that, we use what's called Amazon Mechanical Turk. So this is an online experiment where we, and then we can use this experiment and the controlled setting that it provides to better understand what other cognitive factors may affect position bias, or may affect people to choose one particular answer over another. And finally, what exactly is the effect of social influence? There's a Music Lab study, famously, by Seljanik et al., where they seem to suggest that the social influence is a major factor in making the answer popular over quality, for example. And there's some more recent studies which seem to suggest that the position effect is the most important effect, where, again, people are most likely to choose things that they see first, or things that are listed at the top. So what we do is create an experiment where we have essentially 4 different worlds, and 3 of them, the answer position is randomized. For example, in this case, we have no score, which is the random case. We have scores that are listed randomly, And it's important to mention that these scores have no correlation to the actual underlying quality of the answer. These are simply randomly generated values. And finally, we have the stack exchange model, where scores elicit highest to lowest, which is a good approximation for what you really see in stack exchange. And then there's a fourth world that we're currently working on, where users can upvote answers and score dynamically updates, which would sorry, yes.
Sorry, so I'm a little unclear as to how so this is all about quality, and how do you know what the quality of the answers are?
That's a good question. So we are able to separate the effective quality and the position effect of the score by creating a proxy, which is controlling for the scores people see and the positions, what answers are more popular than others. And in fact, we see consistently across all our experiments, there are consistently more popular answers in the experiments than there's consistently more certain answers that are more popular than others. Therefore, where we ask the mechanical Turkers to choose what they consider the best answer. Therefore, that sort of gives us a proxy. So this is an example of what people see. Top here is the stack exchange question, while below is 2 or 8 answers, which are also from stack exchange. So in essence, this experiment has real questions and real answers to better approximate how the stack exchange board. First off, we find that social influence alone is in fact weak. So in the social influence world, where again, you sort of randomize the position, but you sort of stick on various scores to each answer. When 2 answers are visible, the probability that an answer is chosen only weakly increases with score. So meaning that that people may be more likely to choose an answer that's more popular, but that effect is very small. And in fact, that effect is essentially nothing when 8 answers are visible. So if we very when there are 8 answers visible, you might the effect of popularity seems to be nothing. So this means that the reasons for people to choose an answer are much more to do with, say, other factors besides social influence. And one, of course, going back to the big data that we found was position bias, where we determine whether users choose the answers that are listed first. And it's well known, another motivation for this is that it's well known to affect web page results. That is, say, people are more likely to click on answers that are listed first, rather than, or links that are listed first, rather than those same links that are listed lower down the page. It's also known to affect voter ballots, which is one of the other motivations for us to understand this behavior, which is that in some natural experiments, they found that candidates are actually more likely to be chosen if they're at the top of the ballot than at the bottom. And the questions we specifically aim to answer are what is the impact of position bias and quality and score. So given the inherent qualities I mentioned, so the inherent popularity of an answer, how does position bias increase or decrease that popularity? And is there something else that score may do to enhance position bias, as an example? And then finally, what causes position bias? So although we may say that this position bias exists, are there factors that actually can enhance it or can explain what we're seeing? So here, for example, is the probability to choose an answer versus its position down the web page. In this case, we have no score visible, and you find that when 2 answers are visible, the actual effect of the likelihood for someone to choose the first or second answer is roughly equal. Where in this case, the error bars are smaller than the plot mark, so I don't show the error bars for simplicity. On the other hand, we find that when 8 answers are visible, this position bias is very visible. We see that people are more likely to choose top answers than bottom ones. And then more interesting still, when we list answers from, scores from highest to lowest, we see the position bias is enhanced even more. So although the effective score individually is nothing, or virtually nothing, when we have scores next to answers and list the scores from highest to lowest, this greatly enhances the position bias. For example, although here we see very little effect due to position bias when two answers are visible, when we have scores listed in the model, the position biases are very large, and it's even greater when 8 answers are visible. Furthermore, what we have here is in gray a null attention model, where we say people choose answers proportional to the amount of time they look at them. And separately in the study, we found that this is a very good approximation for what people do. That in the data aggregated, we find that people are more likely to choose answers that they pay more attention to, but that that doesn't completely explain the behavior we see. That although people give more attention to the top answers than bottom answers, people are much more likely to choose top answers than bottom answers compared to that null model. Therefore, the attention may be one factor that enhances the position bias, especially when the score is visible compared to when the score is not visible. But there are other factors that play as well. So to sort of summarize what we've sort of found is that position bias is perhaps implicitly affected by the privacy effect, which that people prefer answers that they see first. And this would explain why we see position bias even when there's no score visible. And importantly, we separately checked and found that people look at the answers listed first, then later down the web page. This could be one plausible explanation. We also noticed that attention is another factor to enhance position bias. That is to say, highly visible answers are picked independent of position, and that in the stack change model, users, the answers seen first actually receive more attention. And then there's trust bias, where people may trust answers that are listed first, which would also help explain why we see this enhanced position bias when in the stack exchange model. But importantly, the score alone, the answer score alone has no effect or little effect. And finally, this position bias is enhanced by bounded rationality, that more answers enhances the likelihood for people to choose top answers, just as we saw in the big data. So, and we also have more comparisons to empirical data for, again, grounding our experiment. In this case, we look at the probability of answers chosen in the stack exchange model, where green is the experiment and yellow is data. And what we find is that data, which is presumably quality ordered, that's the people, that the most popular answer is presumably the one with the highest quality, we see the probability people choose that answer is very similar, and when two answers are visible, virtually the same as the experiment where answers are ordered at random. So essentially, it seems to suggest that the position bias is as important, or maybe even more important, than the answer's implicit quality. We further did a natural experiment where around September of 2008, there was a change to stack exchange where answers with the same score were used to be listed chronologically, and then they just were listed at random. So therefore, we could see what is the effect of answers with the same score when they're listed chronologically at random. What is the likelihood that you vote for this oldest answer? So the probability of voting for the oldest answer, well, it used to be the oldest answer was listed first, and now it's randomized. And we see that when the oldest answer is listed first, you're much more likely to choose it than when the answer is randomized, and that this effect increases with the number of answers, or cognitive load, if you will. And in fact, the effect is so pronounced that at the very end, when 15 answers are visible, the effect of changing this rank by 1 can nearly double the probability that this answer gets voted on. So this can actually be a fairly dramatic effect. So to summarize the data we see so far, position bias undermines crowd wisdom. The bias is enhanced by cognitive load, attention, and trust bias. Popularity is not necessarily quality, and there are other biases such as social influence, which is small, and potentially things like cognitive depletion. People may post worse answers, as the work I've done with Emilio. People may post worse answers as time goes on. and that may affect the sort of how people vote as well. But another question to ask is, well, is that the whole story? Is there cases when social influence is in fact important? And this gets into the idea of a rumor mill. So if you actually Google Middle East rumors, the first thing that comes up is not some bizarre alt-right discussion thread, but in fact is the Coca-Cola company trying to show that they are not working for Israel, that they are not disputed lands, etc. Essentially, this is a good example of when bad ideas become popular, presumably by social influence. One might want to find a mechanism that could decouple success and quality in these sort of offline cases where things are shared not via say stack exchange, but person to person. So more fundamentally, we might ask, well, how do ideas or competing ideas spread? So what we find in work that I've done is that social influence can help explain how voters behave, such as the certain vote distributions, a long-range correlations between votes, as well as in jurors, as I explained, going back to the Condorcet's theorem, we find certain statistics of how jurors deliberate. We find a model with social influence that actually is able to better represent the jury data. And with stockbrokers, we find ways to understand stock crashes can be through a social influence model as well, where we have sort of a critical threshold, people who are easily influenced. Once that critical threshold is reached, then you get these large stock crashes. So here's what we see, for example, with juries. So in this case, we have this is the deliberation time versus the final vote. Essentially, this is the fraction of people who vote guilty. When the number of people voting guilty is either 0 or 1, so almost everyone votes innocent or almost everyone votes guilty, then you see that the deliberation time is rather short. And then this deliberation time seems to increase as there's less consensus. And finally, once you pass this critical threshold here, this is when jurors are hung, meaning that that a retrial is necessary. The deliberation time spikes. In fact, it seems to be peaking right before these dashed lines, and maybe even a little smaller, a little lower, when it's exactly 6-6 or 3 versus 3. And this is across many different data sets. In this case, we look at Oregon in 1973 to 1976, and this is California data from 1960 to 1984. Also interesting is that we see a very strong trend between deliberation time and the time jurors are in trial. In this case, this across both Oregon, California, and more recent data from Washington, Nebraska from the 90s to the 2000s, we see that deliberation time approximately follows the trial time to the 1/2. And furthermore, we find that jurors rarely reach complete consensus, but they also avoid hanging if they can. And in fact, it's very dramatic. They might even get to a decision that's nearly hung, but as long as they're not hung, they stop, but they avoid hanging if they can help it. And also, the time for jurors to reach deliberation is a fairly heavy tail. Not a universal tail per se, but it's nonetheless a sort of an exponential-like tail. So in summary, we see the final jury distribution is one where jurors rarely hang. There's often not complete consensus. The deliberation time is such that jurors that hang deliberate longer. There's a correlation essentially between the deliberation time and the time they are in trial. And finally, there's a heavy tail distribution of the deliberation time. So we can create a model where to explain this. In this model, we have herding, that people tend to follow the majority. That there's increase in stubbornness, that individuals stick to their opinion the longer they hold it, and that they try to avoid hanging. To give you an example, you might have an individual here in green. He looks at his other neighbors and he says, okay, he's in the minority, so he's going to follow the majority. That's sort of the idea of the model. And essentially, qualitatively, this is one piece of the data. And you see that the model, which is in blue, is able to outcompete many competing models. And I'll show you in a second quantitatively that this is true. For example, it can help explain why jurors rarely hang. It can also help explain why there's a peak in the deliberation time when jurors are hung, and that there seems to be a drop in the deliberation time when jurors are completely evenly split. And as well, it can help explain the heavy tail distribution in the deliberation time. So which model wins? Well, we use something called log likelihood, which is a very sort of a principled way of determining what model works better than others. The reason we use, say, log likelihood over the BIC or AIC is because there are certain non-parametric models here. But when we use BIC and AIC where it's relevant, we still find our model outperforms the others. So in this case, we have null models where sort of the final vote is randomized. We have models where the jurors, the deliberation ends when the last juror makes his or her decision. And in all these cases where there's essentially no deliberation, no influence. And as well, we have models where we remove the parameter in our model where there's herding, or remove the parameter in our model where there's stubbornness, and we again see much worse fits to the data. So essentially, this influence model is quantitatively better, and alternate models perform worse. Ones where we remove herding or stubbornness from the model. This 2-time skill model in the previous section, where they stop and the last person makes up their mind, as well as models where you sort of randomize the final vote in more or less sophisticated ways. Other things that we can find about this model are things that actually agree with previous psychological research. For example, this parameter we find for herding, the probability that you choose the majority opinion, decreases with the size of the data. And in fact, it would seem to suggest that jurors are more resistant to peer pressure in larger groups.
So herding determines how likely you are to follow majority?
Yeah.
So the lower it is, the less likely.
Yes.
So the bigger the group size, the less likely people are to follow majority?
Exactly.
Huh.
Which seems counterintuitive.
Yes.
But actually, so first off, although herding exists, the fact that it decreases with the number of jurors is in agreement with this paper by Sachs and Marty from 1997, which showed exactly that, to understand why larger groups have less jurors who hang, I think it was. So, sorry, larger groups have more jurors who hang. And I think it's similar to if you have, there's this work where if you might have 5 people who say this line is longer than this line, that 6th person will say, okay, I'll follow the majority. But if you're able to have a confederate, a known person who's able to disagree, even if you have the same fraction of people who are in the majority, it could be 5-1, or it could be 10-2. The fact that you have a compatriot allows you to be more resistant to the alternative opinions.
Is this data based on the fact that there's different size juries?
Yes, so I should mention that the data has jurors that are either 6 individuals, 8 individuals, or 12 individuals.
I thought there were always 12.
Usually that is the case, especially in, I think, in criminal juries. Yeah. But there are also civil cases where you have 6 or 8, especially in California.
But criminal require unanimous, but civil don't require unanimous.
That's right. So I should say, I simplified it a little. I'm specifically looking at civil juries here. I was able to separate it out when I could. When we look at criminal juries, we actually find the same model fits just as well, outperforms the others. So yeah, we're focusing right now on civil. And actually, it's, although for the most part true that criminal juries depend on unanimity, that's not completely true in certain cases. Like Oregon happens to allow for non-consensus opinions.
In criminal cases.
In criminal cases.
So I think the downward trend is pretty intuitive if you think about consensus emergence, and it's much easier to find consensus in smaller groups. And as group size increases, you would find it harder and harder to find consensus. In fact, what happens is that for large groups you have polarization. So you would have actually two, bifurcation, and the consensus is now split in two parts. So
Right.
two groups consenting to completely opposite positions. Right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if this is the case. I mean, if it cannot happen with juries. I mean, you cannot test it with juries because juries, find size up to 12.
Yeah.
Right? But I wonder if you can test it with larger systems.
Well, certainly, when you look at, for example, Congress or something like that, there's a lot of work recently on how these people have over time split into their separate domains, and there's a lot less agreement. Although that might be a special case. Now, if we had a sort of longitudinal study with the very same people and saw how they behaved, that would be a good question. I mean, there's also psychological research that says that individuals who are sort of more homogeneous in their opinion, like pro-gun or anti-gun, as they meet, they become more and more sort of pushed towards one end or the other. So it would make sense that if people split initially and they're more talking to themselves, that split might only grow. But I don't know of research necessarily, not that it doesn't exist, but I don't know of research necessarily that it's looked at that. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yes.
Is there any information about actual performance metrics of jury decisions, so that you know whether or not the jury actually made a correct decision or something that was overturned later on or something like that?
Yeah. So there's only limited data on the performance of jurors versus, say, individuals like judges. I didn't actually discuss in this presentation, but there has been a little bit of initial work on that exact question. I list the citation in the paper for this, and I'll show it to you after the presentation, where some experimental data seem to suggest that jurors are about as good as judges in certain things, but they're statistically significantly worse at determining whether defendants are correctly judged guilty or something like that. So I think they're more likely to incorrectly judge defendants as guilty compared to judges. And at least the data has wide error bars. That's the one that's statistically significant. So it seems to suggest that, at least in certain cases, jurors may perform worse than judges. And in fact, I'll get to you in a second as to the reason why that's actually true. Yeah. So basically, we also find this for voters and stockbrokers. And I intentionally made this a little long, so I'm just going to skip through this briefly. But the similar model where we have influence and stubbornness can explain empirical data here. I'm going to have to go through this quickly. But essentially, in this case, to explain sort of the reason why you have these outliers, which are called drag kings and stocks, you have a simple model where you have one parameter model, and independent of the value of that parameter, find these large outliers as well, called dragging kings. And the reason is because you have this sort of large initial component of people who are easily influenced, and they're able to influence people who are less likely to be influenced, and suddenly you get sort of these dramatic sell-offs or buy-ins. So what's important about herding? Why we're discussing this? There's a nice paper by Keniowski and Zagorev, and there are a few others similarly that find that with greater herding, i.e. with more correlations between individuals, the crowds can even do worse than individuals. And that's where we find that we have a mechanism for jurors to influence each other. Why is that important? Well, it seems that basically this line would be if crowds were as good as individuals. This black line is if there's no correlation. This was the Condorcet's theorem, but even with a correlation of 0.2, relatively small correlations, you find that when people are not completely certain that they are correct, the group performs worse than the whole. And because I mentioned before that in experiments, find that juries can sometimes perform worse than judges, this might be a reason for that. It might not necessarily be because jurors are less knowledgeable, but is because they influence each other. So in summary, we find that herding and stubbornness affects group decisions. Herding may undermine crowd wisdom. Other work seems to find agreement with this. There's some work that I've done on learning complex ideas. So in conclusion, just to give you an idea of what we found, crowds are smart but not perfect. But in specifically Kasparov versus the world, why did the crowd lose, as I mentioned? Well, one effect was social influence. that a few people had enormous influence to such a degree that between move like 20 and 50, so 30 different moves, was all decided by a single individual. And people saw what moves were popular, which meant that the popular moves got yet more popular by either the position effect or maybe a little bit by social influence. And popular moves were not always the best. Another factor to mention is speed. One crucial game decision which could have made the game into a draw actually was decided too late. So,
quick question to understand the final conclusions.
Sure.
Did players in the crowd know, let's say their identity? Did they know who was in the crowd? The other players who were suggesting.
Yes, so more specifically, it was a sort of MSN did a sort of form, so people had usernames, not necessarily full names, but users. So,
But how would one person get so much influence?
there were certain people who were either international masters, grandmasters, basically people who are very good at chess, who were picked in advance by MSN as being sort of like the moderators of the forum, and they were given suggestions, and their suggestions were often allowed. So yeah, we're running out of time, but I just want to mention overall what we find in this data is there are ways to reduce position bias and therefore presumably increase card wisdom, give people fewer options, and to remove the popularity metric, which I said, even if social influence alone is not a big factor, it increases the position effect. There are ways to reduce herding, and jurors is to not pose the jury cutoff. The moment you say that people are within here hung and people are not there are not hung, that actually sort of seems to force this influence to be greater in our model. And for brokers, for example, it's probably best to avoid, if you want to reduce market volatility, you might want to not reduce the crowd, or else you short sell, because if everyone's going to sell, you short sell, you can make money. So the future directions are thinking fast and slow. So basically, if we aggregate slow decisions, we have less biased decisions. And what's important about this is that we can allow for crowd wisdom to develop under the hood. We don't have to force people to look at certain answers or in certain different ways. We can allow the best answers to presumably bubble up to the top simply based on being choosy about whose opinion you respect. There's also this idea of first mover advantage, that low quality answers seem to be can sometimes be the top answers in Stack Exchange or whatever. And this seems to be related to a monkey model created by a student at UC Davis called Martin Postby. And there's also work on successive research labs that I want to do in the future. Why are some labs successful and others fail? Is there an idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? Here's my bibliography. I would like to thank my collaborators at UC Davis from political science, computer science, and engineering, including certain Christina Lerman, as well as, of course, Emilio. Yeah, other people from other different disciplines like cognitive science and physics. And I thank you for your time.
First one I've asked anyways. Obviously, favors that one of the reasons why you observe is biases on is that is the temporal signature of when the questions are produced. Sorry, the answers are produced to the questions. So someone gets there first, they're more likely to receive more visits, more attentions, more votes, and so on. So I was wondering if on the future you're thinking about maybe doing, and I give you an analogy. I'm thinking of it as a 100-meter dash, where some of the each runner is an answer. Some of the runners start earlier than others, right?
Yeah,
so if you can maybe simulate an experiment where you have a question and then all the answers like accumulate up until to a threshold, like I don't know, 5 answers, and then they're all put there together and see how that.
Well, so I should mention that in the experiment we did to understand position bias, and even in the data, we'll look at given all the answers visible at once. in the experiment, we said people only see 2 or 8 answers. We didn't have answers accumulate. So we were able to separate the effect of a first mover advantage from position bias. But it is important that I don't think I've seen much previous research on the effect of first mover advantage, specifically in crowd wisdom platforms. So it would be interesting to see if first off, the effect that has, and maybe if there are ways to reduce the effect, like as Christina has done in previous research, maybe have the most recent answer or most recently voted answer be the one listed first. It's sort of like if people saw what was the most popular tweet ever on Twitter, well, that's going to be stable, and that won't allow for other really good tweets to bubble up to the top. So the fact that Twitter, for example, lists answers or lists tweets by recency may actually improve its quality.
But there was also work by Peter Kraft about cumulative sequential voting,
Yes,
which
yes.
might actually also tie into the.
Right, yeah, so there's also work by Peter Kraft and Sellis and other people who said there can be sometimes advantages to this herding effect, where you essentially, theoretically at least, having answers sequentially added, having votes sequentially added, given answers, you can improve the you can have a better sense of what are good answers and not, but it might be slightly different. I don't know.
Yeah, my second part of the question was about your jury work.
Yeah.
So you showed this nice, plot where you have correlations that are non-zero and that how affects the consensus.
Sure.
So I was wondering if that can be a nice methodological tool to show when maybe there are biases in the juries, right? I think you just passed it.
Yep.
This one, right? So here you have, the probability that the jury is correct or not. And if the correlation to me seems to be, a source of correlation might be biases, right? Racial bias. In the jury, people have some correlated biases, and people converge towards maybe a biased decision. Maybe that this could be a tool to study those cases where there was a bias, there was some implicit bias in the jury, maybe a racial bias, right? You can observe that maybe cases that were African American were wrongly convicted because of a jury decision that was wrong, but it was driven by an implicit or existing bias in the jury. You can use this.
Potentially, yeah. Like for instance, as a really basic model, one could look at, say, in 60s and 70s juries, if you look at the proportion of people who are black or white in the jury, if you had more white, it might be more of the same opinion and more of a racist opinion. Again, this is back in the day. I'm not saying that's true necessarily now. And then with greater bias or with greater diversity, you might have things that are more close to zero. Yeah.
There's no data on that.
I don't know. No, I don't think so. But it's worth thinking about.
That jury composition.
Or even defendants.
The data I know on jury composition, they give things like salaries, but I don't know if they give things like races.
I also know the salary correlates.
Well, but defendant in your data set, there was no information about defendants.
Yeah, I don't think there was very much. No.
Is there information about the nature of the case itself?
We know if it was civil or criminal. Okay. In certain data sets, we knew the type of civil cases. Although we only have so much data, so we had to somewhat aggregate over.
Sure, but I wonder because I imagine at least some types of cases. Building up of that would disproportionately affect one group of persons.
Possibly, yeah. We certainly
within specific time spans and areas. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Well, we are actually right on time, and it was very fascinating. Thank you.